and welcome to this very special broadcast that we are bringing to you from outside the White House. And I have an august panel with me, and we're going to be looking at India-US strategic cooperation on the eve of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit and the Quad meeting between President Joe Biden, the premiers of Japan as well as Australia. And joining me this evening is Lisa Curtis, Senior Fellow and Director, Indo-Pacific Security Program. With me here, Catherine B. Hada, also former Consul General, joins this broadcast. And with me is also Dov Zekim, former Under-Secretary of Defense in the George W. Bush administration and currently the Senior Advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining me on this broadcast. And I begin with looking forward to this meeting, the Quad meeting that is taking place. Over the years, ever since President Trump and then President Joe Biden have put their weight behind Quad, do you think it's reached the critical mass, making a difference to the strategic environment, really, in the balance of power play in the world? Let's cut the chase and let's come down to, are we any closer to stymieing China with this formation? Or is it just, at the moment, P's and Q's being put in place and not too much action? How do you see this, Lisa Curtis?
Well, I think the Quad has really come into its own. It was revived in 2017 during the Trump administration, and then the Biden administration has really taken it to that next level where you've had 6 meetings of the leaders, 4 in-person meetings, and I think the meeting on Saturday in Wilmington, Delaware, will really show that the Quad, is here to stay, that it has come a very long way, and it does play an important role in shaping the regional order, in bringing together 4 powerful democratic maritime powers that are putting forth initiatives, providing public goods to the region, and really shaping the environment, shaping the economic, technological environment in the region. Now, I do think this meeting will be, one thing to watch for is whether they push forward with a maritime security initiative. I think this would be really important if we see something, the Coast Guard's cooperating, or a joint patrol, a commitment to do joint patrols. This would be really significant because it would show that the Quad is producing tangible security measures that are helping to push back against Chinese maritime aggression. We've seen this in the South China Sea against the Philippines. We've seen it in the East China Sea. So this would be something to watch for, a maritime security initiative.
How do you see this going forward, Catherine? Because many people have spoken about the fact that, India has kept its alliance with Russia. It's also been speaking to Ukraine, trying to put together a peace process. And that brings in a certain amount of question marks, because while each of these 4 countries in the Quad are looking to build strategy to counter other nations, but at the same time, each one of them have their own specific individual interests that they have kept alive. How do you see this balancing out going forward? Are there any breakthroughs that we are going to be looking at? Or, are these equations going to change? Given the fact that even America is in the midst of this very huge election, can policies change one way or another depending on who wins?
I think in terms of the U.S.-India relationship, no matter who wins the election, we're going to see a strengthening of the relationship. And that is for many reasons, including that the rest of the world isn't changing just because we're having an election. The rest of the world isn't changing just because India recently had an election and now has a different coalition government in place. There are certain outlying factors that are going to impel cooperation in groupings like the Quad. I mean, you mentioned India's, for example, strategic autonomy. I mean, I guess to some extent we all have strategic autonomy. I think that's appropriate and proper. I think in addition to showing, though, where we can cooperate as a counter to China, although Quad is not a defense organization, you know, there's certain defense-adjacent activities, such as the one that Lisa was describing. I think the idea behind the Quad, as behind a lot of our cooperation with India and other partners, is to show an alternative to China and the Chinese model. And I think you see that in the cooperation, for example, that the Quad now has on maritime domain awareness with the Pacific Island countries. So we're helping a different region that, you know, China's made huge overtures from, and I think the Quad can be very useful as a structure for partnerships such as that.
Dr. Zakim, my question to you is very specific. The road, the China Belt Road initiative, you know, specifics like that. Can the Quad create something which can actually take care of some of these things which can upset the balance in the region?
Well, there are two sides to that. One is the Belt and Road itself, which is not doing terribly well. And not only that, China's economy is not doing too well, which makes it more difficult for China to prop up the Belt and Road. And China doesn't have a very good reputation when it does come into countries. It tends to strangle them, blackmail them, you know. So the alternative would be a much more, I think, positive approach. And I mean, there's talk of roads literally from India through the waters, through Israel and whatever. Of course, we have a lot of conflict in the Middle East right now. But the fact that the concept has even been considered is terribly, terribly important. And it fits in very, very well with what my colleagues were talking about just a moment ago. You know, when I was in the Reagan administration, we would have what are called passing exercises, PASEXs, with India, where we would go like that. That was as far as we could go. We didn't want anybody to know. India didn't want anybody to know. Now look where we are today. We can thank China for that, for sure. But, you know, Foreign Minister Jaishankar wrote a brilliant book about how he sees India playing in this new world. And the fact is, yes, you've got a relationship with Russia. But on the other hand, the Quad is a relationship between India and 3 allies. That sends a real message to Beijing. And Lisa was talking a moment earlier about some of the military aspects of this. The Chinese are sensitive to any slight change in military activity on the part of those whom it doesn't trust. And last time I checked, it doesn't trust India.
Of course. We've seen that in the Galwan conflict, and we've seen, you know, the relationship between China and India extremely strained at the moment. And of course, it would be India's desire that, you know, people and other nations come together. But are we looking at it realistically? And Lisa, you also co-authored a 35-page report for the Center for a New American Security. And you spoke about, you know, how to compete more effectively. The fact is, in the Quad countries, India might probably be the lowest in terms of its trade balance with China. All the other 3 nations have huge trade with China. Is this standoff or pushing back China easier said than done?
Well, I think it's possible to engage in, you know, cooperative activities that basically circumscribe China's ability to continue to practice aggression, maritime aggression. But certainly there are trade relationships, but, you know, these are changing. There have been export controls on, you know, high-end semiconductor technology going to China. It was India that restricted Chinese apps in India. India was the first to do that after the Galwan crisis that you mentioned. So the economic and trade and, you know, technology relationships with China are changing, and they're becoming much more restrictive. And, we're seeing new initiatives by the Biden administration to put on additional export controls. So I think that it is possible for these four nations to work together to work on, standard setting. When we talk about new and emerging technologies, AI, quantum computing, all of these things people are very concerned about and want to make sure that norms are set. This is something that the Quad can do. They can really shape the environment in the Indo-Pacific region and make it, more supportive of an open, free environment. And that, pertains to trade, that pertains to the seaways and, freedom of movement on the seaways. And, I think it can help to stabilize the region because, let's face it, this is about deterrence. This is about deterring Chinese aggression. And when the four countries work together, when they stand together, that is deterrence.
You worked with the Trump administration. You served in the Trump administration earlier. What would you make of the Chinese foreign minister saying that Quad was artificially creating tension, inciting confrontation and containing the development of other countries? How would you respond to that?
I'm not surprised that China doesn't like the Quad because, that it does show that powerful democracies want to see the preservation of the current regional order, and China wants to upend that order. They want to change things. So it's not surprising that China doesn't like the Quad. But let's remember, in 2007, the Quad met once, senior foreign ministry level. They met one time. China complained, demarched all the countries. Each of the countries backed away. And they didn't meet because they didn't want to provoke China. Well, look what happened. China became more aggressive on India's borders. It's become more aggressive in the South China Sea. It's built artificial islands in the South China Sea. So I think, the answer is to have more Quad cooperation, not less.
You think that's the strategic way to go for sure. But do you think it's also practical because, frankly, none of the other countries have borders adjoining China, but India does. And we paid the price in Galwan, and there's tension almost all the time. How does that work?
Well, first of all, we Americans are a Pacific nation. Don't forget that. And not just Hawaii, but all the way out to Guam and the Marianas we have a relationship with. And the Chinese are pushing in that area. We also have a commitment to Taiwan. China hates that commitment. So we may not be on the border with China, but we are confronting China. The Australians are not on the border with China, but they've been pressured by China. They've been bullied by China. They can't stand it either. The Japanese feel pressure from China as well. So what unites the four of us is this sense that China does not want to be a responsible player in the world, and especially in the region. All four of us feel exactly the opposite. Everybody should have a chance. Nobody should be bullied. Borders are sacrosanct. That's not the way Beijing looks at it. Just ask Mr. Xi.
How do you see this, Catherine? And do you see any shifting of gears depending on who wins these elections, Republicans or Democrats?
When it comes to the Quad, no. And when it comes to concerns about China, no. I mean, I totally agree with my colleague said here. I think it's important, though, you had mentioned something about wanting to sort of suppress China. I'm paraphrasing you. I think to build on what Dov was saying, what we're concerned about is malign behavior by China. So threatening Taiwan, threatening the Philippines, that would be in the strategic sense. I think there was a sense after COVID, a lack lack of accountability and cooperation. That was a strategic threat, too. The APIs, the pharmaceutical, everyone realized suddenly how dependent they were and that China could just turn it off. So supply chain resilience became an issue. I think what we're looking at is undesirable behavior, whether it's unfair subsidies, dumping of a lot of industrial production on the world economy. And we are not alone. The Quad countries are not alone. This is Western Europe. This is Italy that left the Belt and Road Initiative. There's a lot of concern. But I think that being said, the one point of caution I would add is we have to be careful about saying we're not wanting to suppress China as a whole, because I think a China that abides by global norms, that isn't threatening its neighbors, that is about openness, we would welcome, even if that came at economic competition with us.
Is that a thought real?
I believe it is real. Thank you for being so playful. But yes, I believe it is real, because the one thing I think we can agree with, especially India with a long border, we don't want an unstable China. We don't want a collapsing China. We want a China that plays by rules and does not threaten its neighbors or the global economy or security.
Do you think that's realistic, that hope?
Well, hope is always hope. I would say that the only way that Mr. Xi and the Communist Party of China will change their ways is if they see that the world will not let them bully. There's no other way to do it. Look, we do a lot of business. You mentioned that. We do tremendous business with China. And we don't mind doing business with China. We mind them stealing our intellectual property. We mind them sending students who work here and then take all our trade secrets back to China. In other words, we don't like them playing unfairly. And maybe if Mr. Xi recognizes that his approach to the Chinese economy, which just about every economist I know says is a disaster, and I'm an economist and I agree, maybe he will recognize that what Xi Jinping did, which was to be a responsible actor overseas and to build up the Chinese economy, if he follows Deng's way, things will already be different.
So let me throw this up in the air. Two questions that really Indians would want to know. How does America see Modi? Modi vis-a-vis Biden and, let's say, Kamala Harris, if she were to win, and Modi with Donald Trump, and how do these equations work? How do you see that?
Well, I think that if no matter who is elected, whether it's Kamala Harris or Donald Trump, I think you will continue to see a strong, growing U.S.-India partnership. There's broad bipartisan support for growing the U.S. relationship with India. It's come very far in the last 20 years. I would say particularly far in the last 8 or so years. And I don't think any leader would want to sacrifice that progress. So I think, in broad strokes, you will see good relations no matter who's elected. Now,
that's a motherhood statement. I want to ask you, given the background of Kamala Harris's position on, let's say, Article 370, Kashmir, didn't go down well with the Indian administration, especially because the Modi government is passionate about Article 370 and Kashmir being an integral part of India. So many people ask the question, will things change?
Well, again, I think if President Trump is elected, he had very good relations with Modi, relations improved under Trump, and I think they would pick up where they left off. And, I'm very confident that the relationship would continue to progress. If Kamala Harris is elected, it's a bit more complicated. Indian American woman, she's has that heritage. I think that could be a very positive thing for a lot of Indians. But as you say, maybe some of her positions have been more controversial on Kashmir or human rights issues. There was the controversy over one of her relatives apparently had tweeted something about supporting the farmers' movement. That did not go over well in India. So there's, a few more complicating factors. But I think that, she would carry forward the hard work the Biden administration has done on the relationship. She recognizes the geostrategic realities, which is India and the U.S. share the same concerns about China. And so I think, some of those issues that Indians might be concerned about would probably, fade to the background.
Hopefully. Catherine, how do you see this? And what are the chances, again?
I thought we would be fighting a lot, and I'm sorry to disappoint you. We really are getting along on most things, all three of us, and I would agree.
Where everybody, two Indians and there are 200 views. So
I would say that I agree with Lisa that the general trajectory would be, the same, a strengthened relationship, because, as we said earlier, the rest of the world isn't changing. But also, I almost regret that China takes up so much oxygen when we talk about our relations. There's a lot going on. We're ending this week with the Quad, but we started it with the U.S.-India Strategic Economic Partnership discussion. I mean, there's a huge range of issues that we're talking about. If I were to make a prediction, maybe the issues of climate change and clean energy would be de-emphasized more, issues like that in Trump administration. So some of the areas of cooperation that were not defense and security related or defense adjacent, like supply chains, you might see some variation in that. And you might see some variation in what would cause dust-ups between us. There is the issue of, internal Indian dynamics, which might come up more in a Kamala Harris administration, but there's the possibility of trade disagreements, quite vocal ones, that might come up more in a Trump administration. But as I always point out, when I started working with India several years ago,
in Hyderabad,
there was still blowback from a case of an Indian consulate employee in New York and her treatment by the New York police that redounded through the entire relationship. Now we have disagreements about things like Russia, Ukraine, and look at the levels of our cooperation on so many issues.
So you think these conversations will keep going on the sidelines, but the main strategic relations will carry on whichever side wins this? But the real question, Dov, is who's winning the American elections?
Well, if I knew
because
that...
in front of White House, you must make a prediction.
If I knew that, I'd be a very rich man right now. The problem is, you see the polls, right? Polls are not entirely accurate. Look what happened in Britain, for example. In fact, a friend of mine has a daughter who is now a Labor minister, first time elected. The polls the day before the election said she was going to lose. And my friend was devastated, and he stayed up all night, and she won. There are many, many people who will not tell the truth to polls, particularly if they're Trump voters. Okay? They don't want to tell the pollsters they're Trump voters for whatever reason. There are other people who just hang up on pollsters. So you have the problem that polls don't really tell you much. That's number one. Number two, we have the peculiarity of the Electoral College. Small states have an outsized vote, in a sense, because they are given this, in the Senate, the same number of people as New York and California. Okay? And so when you look at the Electoral College and you look at the small states, many of them are Republican-oriented. But then you have the issue of abortion. Kansas, which is one of the most conservative states in America, and has been for years, voted against anti-abortion laws. What that tells me is this election is really too close to call, number one. Number two, whatever happens vis-a-vis India, I would argue there will be a difference. Trump has a relationship with Modi. The Democrats have a relationship with India. Okay? Whichever way you go, it's not going to change. In that respect, I do agree with my colleagues. It's just not going to change very much, which, by the way, should really get Beijing to worry.
Okay, is Beijing worried? Well, we'll find that out. But any crystal ball gazing on who's who's winning these elections, because he's complicated by saying polls are not right. Well, they're not right anywhere. I thought Indian pollsters got it wrong all the time, but you're saying American pollsters can get it wrong too. But sometimes it's your hunch that works. What's your hunch?
What's more important than who wins is, do the American people have faith in the process? You know, we've had 2 assassination attempts against a presidential candidate. You know, this is serious. Our candidates need to be able to be safe. They need to be able to campaign. And we need, you know, civil rhetoric. So I think, you know, what's most important here is that the democratic process in the United States moves forward peacefully, and that whoever wins, there is faith that the process was carried out in a fair and just way, and that people peacefully accept the results. I think that's the most important thing.
That's the challenge.
I'll give you a blunt one. She didn't like my answer.
No, I like every answer, but everybody likes black and white. So we want to know what's going to happen.
I can't give you black and white, but I can tell you this. If Joe Biden was still running for president, Trump would win for sure, okay? I know people who started watching that debate and ran out after 5 minutes crying because they were Biden supporters. What Harris has done is change the entire trajectory, and it's still going up. So the real question is, if it continues to go up, she wins, pure and simple. If it flattens out, different story. Does that help you a bit?
A little bit. And Catherine?
If I were advising and just pointing to the importance of having institutionalization of things like the Quad and cooperation, this is a time potentially this next year, let's say, where both governments might get a little distracted with domestic policies. In our case, no matter who wins the election, there's going to likely be a lot of bitterness and recriminations and casting of doubt on an institutional basis. There's also the Congress and how, you know, deadlocked the Congress may remain. And then with the Indian government, you know, the alliance, the coalition government also calls into, you know, a little bit of question potentially about the direction, you know, domestically and in foreign policy, I would say, that the Indian government might take. But this just speaks to me to the importance of having an institutionalized relationship that I think we're building step by step by step between our countries, and that's why it's so important.
Well, the oldest democracy and the largest democracy have their own challenges. Back home, whichever way these elections go in the United States of America, just like the elections that just concluded in India, everybody's got their money bet on the fact that relations between the two countries will move forward strategically. That's not going to change. However, both countries might be a little more involved in their domestic issues over the next 12 months. And what will that mean for the power play across the world? Well, we'll have to wait and watch. But thank you very much to all of you, Dove, Catherine and Lisa Curtis, for joining me right here in Washington and debating and discussing where we as two countries with very, very common interests are going to go from here. Thank you very much. And thank you, viewers, for joining me on this very special broadcast.